I stood at the podium in my dress blues, every medal earned through blood and sweat gleaming under the chandeliers of the grand ballroom, and looked directly at Richard Whitmore as I said the words that would change everything. Sometimes the most dangerous battles aren't fought with weapons, but with the quiet dignity of knowing your worth when others try to convince you that you have none. The room of 500 guests fell silent. My former future father-in-law's face drained of color. 3 weeks earlier, this man had called me a prostitute in German at his own dinner table, assuming I wouldn't understand. Tonight I was being honored as a hero while he was forced to applaud. But before I tell you how I got here, how I turned humiliation into vindication, I need you to understand something. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about refusing to disappear. If you've ever been made to feel small by someone who thought they were better than you, if you've ever had to prove your worth to people who should have seen it from the start, stay with me. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me about a time you stood up for yourself. Because what happened next changed not just my life, but showed me that sometimes the people who underestimate you are the ones who need to learn the hardest lessons. Let me take you back to where this really started. 6 months before that gala, I received a text from Ethan that made my stomach drop. Dinner at my parents' house this Friday. They want to get to know you better before the wedding. I stared at those words in my small apartment near the naval base, still in my training gear, and felt something I rarely felt even in combat zones. Dread. Pura instinctive dread. Ethan Whitmore was everything I thought I wanted. A successful attorney, thoughtful, the kind of man who brought me coffee during my overnight shifts and never complained about my unpredictable schedule. We'd met at a charity event for veterans, and he'd seemed genuinely interested in my work, my experiences not intimidated by the fact that I could probably take down someone twice my size. But I'd only met his parents once briefly, at a crowded engagement party where they'd been polite but distant. Now I was being summoned to the inner sanctum. I stood in front of my closet that Friday evening, running my hands over the few dresses I owned. Most of my wardrobe consisted of uniforms, tactical gear, and workout clothes. I chose a simple navy dress, elegant but understated, paired with modest heels. As I looked at myself in the mirror, I thought about something my commanding officer once told me. Lane, you can walk into any room in the world and command respect. Don't ever forget that. I repeated those words to myself as I drove to the Whitmore estate in Potomac, Maryland, trying to shake the feeling that I was driving toward an ambush rather than a family dinner. The mansion rose before me like something out of a different era. Stone columns, manicured gardens, a circular driveway with a fountain in the center. My father was a mechanic. I'd grown up in a 2-bedroom house where we fixed what broke because we couldn't afford to replace it. I'd put myself through college on scholarships and worked 3 jobs before joining the Navy. This world of inherited wealth and casual luxury was as foreign to me as the mountains of Afghanistan where I'd served. I parked my modest sedan next to a collection of luxury cars and took a deep breath. You've faced down enemies with actual weapons, I reminded myself. You can handle a dinner party. Margaret Whitmore opened the door, her smile perfect and practiced. She was wearing what I'd later learn was a Chanel suit, pearls at her throat, every blonde hair in place. Harper, how lovely. Do come in. The warmth didn't reach her eyes. She led me through a foyer with marble floors and paintings that probably cost more than I'd make in a decade into a sitting room where Richard Whitmore stood with a martini in hand. Former ambassador to Belgium, current board member of 6 prestigious institutions, and according to Ethan, a man who valued legacy above all else. He was tall, silver-haired, with the kind of authoritative presence that came from a lifetime of people doing what he said. He shook my hand with just enough pressure to be polite but not warm. Lieutenant Commander Lane. Ethan speaks very highly of you. The feeling is mutual, sir. You've raised an exceptional son. I kept my voice steady, my handshake firm. I'd briefed foreign diplomats and military commanders. I could handle small talk with my future in-laws. But then another man entered the room and the temperature seemed to drop. Ah, James, perfect timing, Richard said. Lieutenant Commander Harper Lane, this is James Sterling, an old colleague of mine from the diplomatic corps. James, this is Ethan's fiancée. Sterling was Richard's age with cold eyes that assessed me like I was a business transaction. He smiled, but it was the smile of a shark. Richard has told me about you. Quite an unusual match for the Whitmore family. The words hung in the air, polite enough on the surface, but loaded with condescension. I felt Ethan stiffen beside me where he'd just joined us from his old bedroom upstairs. Before I could respond, I went with honesty. I suppose that depends on whether you measure compatibility by bank accounts or character, Mr. Sterling. Margaret's eyes widened slightly. Richard's jaw tightened. But Sterling just laughed, though it was a hollow sound. My dear, in families like ours, those things are often the same. I smiled back, not breaking eye contact. Then I suppose it's fortunate that I've built my life on serving something bigger than myself rather than maintaining appearances. Ethan squeezed my hand, a silent plea to back down, but I saw the flicker of annoyance in his father's eyes. We moved to the dining room, a cavernous space with a table that could seat 20. Crystal glasses, fine china, more silverware than I knew what to do with. I'd been to state dinners, formal military ceremonies, but this felt different. This felt like a test I was meant to fail. The first course arrived, some kind of soup I couldn't identify, and Richard began his interrogation under the guise of polite conversation. So Harper, tell us about your family. Ethan mentioned your father is in automotive work. He owns an auto repair shop in Ohio. Taught me everything I know about fixing what's broken. Richard nodded, but I could see the dismissal in his eyes. And your mother, she passed when I was 12. Breast cancer. I kept my voice steady, refusing to show how that wound still ached. I'm sorry to hear that, Margaret murmured, and for a moment I thought I saw something genuine in her expression. But Richard pressed on. And you went to state school, correct? Ohio State, on a full academic scholarship, yes. Then officer candidate school, then SEAL training. Sterling leaned forward, his wine glass dangling from his fingers. I still find it fascinating that they let women into the SEALs. Seems like lowering standards for the sake of politics. The air left my lungs. Ethan's hand tightened on his fork. But before he could speak, I responded, my voice like ice. The standards didn't change, Mr. Sterling. We just proved that chromosomes don't determine capability. I graduated top of my class. But I imagine from your position, it's easier to question credentials than to acknowledge that the world is changing around you. Richard cleared his throat, clearly annoyed at the turn in conversation. What Harper means is that the military has evolved. Though I must say, dear, the SEAL life is incredibly dangerous. Unpredictable. Not exactly the foundation for a stable family, is it? And there it was. The real concern. Not whether I was good enough for their son, but whether my career made me unsuitable for the life they'd planned for him. With respect, Sir Ethan knew what he was getting into when he proposed. I've been honest about my career from day one. Of course, Richard said, waving his hand dismissively. But surely you'll consider a different path once you're married. Something more suited to the wife of a Whitmore. I felt my face flush. I'm not becoming a Whitmore to retire at 32, sir. I'm a Navy SEAL. That's not a job. It's who I am. The tension at the table was thick enough to cut. Margaret attempted to change the subject, asking about wedding plans, but the damage was done. I could feel Richard's disapproval radiating across the table like heat from a furnace. Then, as the main course arrived, Richard turned to Sterling and began speaking in German. I'd studied German at the Defense Language Institute for a mission 3 years earlier. I'd needed it to infiltrate a human trafficking ring operating out of Hamburg. 6 months of intensive study followed by field practice until I could pass for a native speaker. But I'd never mentioned this to Ethan. It had been classified until recently, and honestly it hadn't come up. So when Richard said in perfect High German, Das Kleid ist billig. Sie sieht aus wie eine Prostituierte, I understood every word. The dress is cheap. She looks like a prostitute. Sterling chuckled and responded in German. You were right, Richard. Not our kind at all. The boy could do so much better. My hands went still on my silverware. Ethan, who'd taken French in school, was oblivious, eating his duck and trying to salvage the evening with small talk to his mother. But I heard everything. Every poisonous word. I had 2 choices. I could pretend I didn't understand, could swallow the humiliation and the rage building in my chest, could smile and nod and play the part they expected. Or I could do what I'd been trained to do. Face the enemy head on. I set down my fork very carefully. I picked up my wine glass and raised it slightly, looking directly at Richard Whitmore. Then in flawless German I spoke. Manchmal lügt der Anzug mehr als das Kleid, Herr Botschafter. Und manchmal ist die wahre Prostitution der Verkauf der eigenen Seele für Prestige. Sometimes the suit lies more than the dress, Mr. Ambassador. And sometimes true prostitution is selling your own soul for prestige. The room went absolutely silent. Richard's face went from tan to gray in seconds. Sterling's wine glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Ethan's head snapped toward me, his eyes wide with shock. Margaret's hand flew to her throat. The silence stretched and stretched until I thought it might break us all. Finally, Richard found his voice. You speak German. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Fluently, I said, switching back to English. I learned it for a mission where I helped take down an international human trafficking ring. We rescued 32 women and children. But please don't let me interrupt your assessment of my clothing. I'm fascinated to hear more of your thoughts. Ethan looked between us confused and beginning to understand something terrible had happened. Dad, what did you say? But Richard had recovered his composure, that diplomatic mask sliding back into place. A simple comment about the lovely dinner. Harper seems to have misunderstood. Did I asked, my voice deadly quiet. Because I'm quite certain you called me a prostitute in front of your friend. In my professional capacity, Mr. Ambassador, I'm trained to gather intelligence, interpret communications, and never miss a detail. So, perhaps you'd like to revise your statement. The rest of that dinner was torture. Richard tried to maintain control, making cutting remarks in English now about military life, about the sacrifices required for a real marriage, about the importance of family legacy. Each comment was designed to put me in my place, to remind me that I was an outsider in their world. But I matched him word for word. When he talked about the importance of education from prestigious institutions, I discussed the tactical training that had kept my unit alive in hostile territory. When Sterling made a comment about the simplicity of military life compared to diplomatic complexity, I described negotiating with tribal leaders in Afghanistan while under threat of attack. When Richard mentioned the need for social grace in their circles, I reminded him that I'd briefed senators and represented the Navy at international conferences. But Ethan said nothing. My fiancé, the man who'd promised to love and support me, sat silently while his father attempted to dismantle me piece by piece. When Margaret tried to interject with neutral topics, Richard would bulldoze over her. I could see the strain in her face, the way she avoided my eyes, and I wondered how many years she'd spent perfecting the art of looking away. Finally, mercifully, the dinner ended. As we said our goodbyes, Richard took my hand and held it just a moment too long. Harper, I hope you understand that we only want what's best for Ethan. Family legacy is everything to us. I trust you'll consider what I've said about finding a more suitable career path. I extracted my hand from his grip. Ambassador Whitmore, I've faced enemy combatants, survived combat situations, and earned every achievement in my career through merit and blood. Your opinion of my dress or my profession doesn't change my value. But I do hope you'll consider what you've revealed about your own character tonight. I walked out of that house with my head high, but the moment I got into my car, I started shaking. Ethan followed me out, got into the passenger seat, and we sat there in silence. Harper, I'm sorry, he finally said. Dad can be difficult. Difficult, I turned to him. Ethan, he called me a prostitute. In German. To his friend. At what was supposed to be a family dinner to welcome me into your family. He didn't mean it like that. He's just old-fashioned protective. He meant it exactly like that. And you said nothing. Ethan flinched. What was I supposed to say? He's my father. I can't just attack him in his own home. I'm supposed to be your wife. Doesn't that count for something? But even as I said it, I saw the answer in his eyes. The weakness. The unwillingness to choose. Can we just go home? He asked quietly. This has been a really stressful night for everyone. I started the car without another word, but something had shifted. Something had broken that I wasn't sure could be fixed. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in passive-aggressive warfare. Richard didn't call me again, didn't invite us back. Instead, he began a campaign of subtle manipulation designed to separate me from Ethan. First came the surprise business trip. Ethan came home one evening 3 weeks after the dinner and announced he'd been asked to handle a major case for the firm in Brussels. It's a huge opportunity, Harper. 6 weeks in Europe working with international clients. Dad pulled some strings to get me on the team. 6 weeks. Ethan, the wedding is in 2 months. I know. But this could make my career. Dad says it's important for me to prove myself, to show I'm not just riding on the family name. I looked at my fiancé and saw what was really happening. Richard was removing him from my influence, showing him the life he could have without the complication of a SEAL wife. And you're going to go. It's my career, Harper. You understand that. You've missed things for deployments. That's different. That's serving my country, not serving your father's need to control your life. We argued for hours, but in the end, Ethan booked his flight. He left the following Monday, and suddenly I was alone planning a wedding while my fiancé was an ocean away, being wined and dined by the European elite his father wanted him to join. Then came the charity gala. I received an invitation to a major fundraising event hosted by the Whitmore Foundation, a black tie affair supporting veterans' causes. Finally, I thought an olive branch. I should have known better. When I arrived at the historic hotel ballroom, I found my name on the seating chart at table 27 in the back corner next to the kitchen doors. Meanwhile, at the head table, I could see Richard and Margaret and several young women in designer gowns who kept glancing toward the empty seat marked for Ethan. He was still in Brussels. These women, I'd learn later, were the daughters of Richard's colleagues, all from prominent families, all suitable replacements for the unsuitable fiancé. I thought about leaving, about walking out and letting Richard have his petty victory. But then I saw the program. The event was honoring SEAL Team veterans, and several of my colleagues were in attendance. Men and women I'd served with, who'd seen me at my best and my worst, who knew exactly what I was worth. I wasn't going to let Richard Whitmore make me feel ashamed of who I was. So I walked through that ballroom with my head high. I stopped at every table where I saw a familiar face, shared stories, laughed about old missions I could now discuss. I made sure every important person in that room saw me not as Ethan's problematic fiancé, but as Lieutenant Commander Harper Lane, a decorated naval officer. When Richard spotted me, he approached with Sterling at his side. "Harper, what a surprise. I didn't think this would be your sort of event." "Really? An event honoring veterans. I can't imagine why you'd think I wouldn't want to be here, sir." Sterling decided to join the attack. "Tell me, Lieutenant Commander, don't you think it's dangerous to glorify military action? All this talk of heroism when really it's just violence dressed up in patriotism." I smiled the same smile I'd used when interrogating enemy combatants. "Mr. Sterling, I spent 3 years gathering intelligence on terrorist networks that were planning attacks on American soil. I've coordinated operations that saved civilian lives. I've held dying friends in my arms and made split-second decisions that meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. If you'd like to discuss the moral complexities of military service, I'm happy to do so. But something tells me your experience with sacrifice extends about as far as choosing which country club to join." Richard's face went red. "There's no need to be rude, Harper. James was simply asking a question, and I simply answered it. But since we're having this conversation, Ambassador, when were you planning to tell Ethan that you've been introducing him to potential alternative fiancés during his trip to Brussels?" I'd done my research. A few well-placed calls to friends who'd been stationed in Europe, some discreet inquiries. I knew about the dinner parties Richard had arranged the daughters of ambassadors and business magnates who'd been seated next to Ethan, the subtle and not-so-subtle suggestions that he could do better. Richard's expression turned cold. "I have no idea what you're talking about. The dinner at the Belgian minister's residence? The yacht party in Monaco, where the Italian ambassador's daughter just happened to be seated next to Ethan for 4 hours. Your former colleague's daughter from the London embassy, who you specifically requested be added to the Brussels project team." Sterling had the grace to look uncomfortable, but Richard didn't back down. "I'm introducing my son to people who can help his career. If he happens to meet accomplished young women from good families in the process, that's hardly my fault. Unlike some people, they understand what it means to be part of something bigger than themselves." "You mean something bigger than their own achievements? Something like inherited wealth and connections they did nothing to earn?" We were starting to draw attention. Other guests were glancing over, sensing conflict. Margaret appeared at Richard's elbow, her smile strained. "Perhaps we should all take a moment. This is supposed to be a celebration." But Richard wasn't done. "You know what your problem is, Harper. You think because you've jumped through a few hoops, because you've proven you can keep up with the men, that you've somehow earned the right to be here. But you don't understand how the real world works. Legacy matters. Breeding matters. And no amount of medals or missions will change the fact that you come from nothing." The words hit me like physical blows. Not because I believed them, but because this was the man whose family I was supposed to join. This was the grandfather of the children Ethan and I had talked about having. This was the patriarch whose approval I'd foolishly thought I might somehow earn. I looked at Richard Whitmore and made a decision. "You're right about one thing, Ambassador. I do come from nothing. My dad worked with his hands. My mom clipped coupons and made miracles happen with cheap groceries. I wore hand-me-downs and worked my way through college because we couldn't afford tuition. But they taught me something your money could never buy. They taught me that a person's value isn't determined by their last name or their bank account. It's determined by what they do when no one's watching, how they treat people who can't benefit them, and whether they stand up for what's right even when it's hard." I stepped closer to him, and for the first time I saw uncertainty in his eyes. "I have earned every single thing I have. No one handed me opportunities because of who my father was. No one opened doors because I went to the right schools. I kicked those doors down myself. And you know what terrifies you. It's that I don't need your approval. It's that I don't need your money or your connections or your name. I am already something. And that's why you've been trying so hard to make me feel like nothing. The confrontation ended there. Margaret pulled Richard away, whispering urgently to him. Sterling disappeared into the crowd. I stood there shaking, knowing I'd just burned a bridge I could never rebuild. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. I left the gala early and drove home in silence. When I got to my apartment, I sat in the dark and finally admitted the truth I'd been avoiding. This wasn't going to work. No matter how much I loved Ethan, no matter how hard I tried to fit into his world, his father would always see me as beneath them. And Ethan would always choose the path of least resistance, caught between the woman he claimed to love and the family he couldn't stand up to. I was about to call him to tell him I couldn't do this anymore when my phone rang. It was my commanding officer. Lane, we've got a situation. Category 5 hurricane just made landfall south of Virginia Beach. The storm surge breached the coastal defenses, and we've got severe flooding. Multiple rescue operations in progress. I need your team mobilized in 2 hours. I felt everything else fall away. This was what I was built for. Not navigating the social minefields of wealthy families, but saving lives when everything went to hell. I'm on my way, sir. I changed into my uniform, grabbed my gear bag, and headed to the base. By midnight, I was in a helicopter, with my team flying into winds that could tear us apart, headed toward a coastal area where nursing homes, hospitals, and residential neighborhoods were underwater. The next 72 hours were a blur of rope deployments, water rescues, and coordinating with local emergency services. We pulled people from rooftops, evacuated a nursing home where elderly residents were trapped on the second floor with water rising, and delivered medical supplies to an emergency shelter that had lost power. I barely slept, barely ate, just moved from crisis to crisis, trusting my training and my team. It was during one of these rescues at an assisted living facility that had lost all power and communication that I met Robert Patterson. He was 87 years old, a retired federal judge trapped in his room on the second floor as water continued to rise. My team was extracting residents one by one, and when I reached his door, I found him sitting calmly in a chair by the window, dressed in a suit despite the chaos. About time someone showed up, he said, but his eyes twinkled with humor. I'm Lieutenant Commander Lane, sir. We're here to evacuate you. I can see that. Fine job you're doing, young lady. Remind me of my daughter. She's a Marine. We got him secured in a rescue harness, and as we prepared to move him to the helicopter, he grabbed my arm. I know you. Saw your picture in the paper a few weeks ago. You're marrying the Whitmore boy, aren't you? I was startled. You know the Whitmore family, known Richard for 40 years. We were at Yale together, served in various capacities in Washington. Good man in his way, but stubborn as hell and blinded by tradition. He studied my face. He's giving you trouble, isn't he? I didn't know how to answer that, so I focused on getting him into the helicopter. But Patterson wasn't finished. Don't let him make you feel small, Commander. Men like Richard, they're terrified of change. You represent everything he doesn't understand. But I'll tell you something. I'd trust someone like you with my life over someone like him any day. And I just did. Those words stayed with me as we continued the rescue operations. The media had shown up by the second day, drawn by the dramatic rescues and the human interest stories. I was too focused on the mission to pay attention, but apparently someone captured footage of me coordinating the nursing home evacuation, standing waist-deep in filthy water, shouting orders while keeping a calm smile for the terrified elderly residents we were extracting. The clip went viral. By the time we'd secured the area and I could finally catch my breath, my phone was flooded with messages. News stations wanted interviews. Social media was exploding with praise. And somewhere in all of it, there was a message from Ethan sent 36 hours earlier. Harper, I just saw the news. Are you okay? Please call me. My dad is furious about the gala. We need to talk. I didn't call back. Instead, I showed up at the press briefing. Our commander had organized, still in my wet uniform, exhausted but alive with purpose. They asked about the rescue operations, about the challenges we'd faced, about how it felt to save so many lives. And for just a moment, I let myself say what I was really thinking. It's an honor to serve. This is what I was trained for, what I dedicated my life to. And I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Because this is who I am. Not someone's fiancé, not a problem to be solved or a reputation to be managed. I'm a naval officer and I'm damn proud of it. The clip of that statement went even more viral than the rescue footage. By the time I got home a week after the hurricane, I'd been asked to speak at a veterans charity gala being organized to support the hurricane relief efforts. The same charity gala where Richard Whitmore was scheduled to be the keynote speaker as one of the major donors. I almost said no. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, and the last thing I wanted was another confrontation. But then I thought about Robert Patterson sitting in that chair in his flooded room telling me not to let Richard make me feel small. I thought about all the women and men I'd served with who'd faced down actual danger while people like Richard sat in comfortable offices and judged them. I accepted the invitation. Ethan returned from Brussels the day before the gala. He came to my apartment, and for the first time in our relationship, I really looked at him. He'd lost weight. He looked tired. But more than that, he looked defeated. "Harper, I'm sorry. I should have stood up to my father. I should have protected you. Why didn't you?" I asked simply. He sank onto my couch. "Because I've never been able to. My whole life I've done what he wanted. The right schools, the right career, the right friends. You were the first choice I made that was entirely my own. And when he pushed back, I didn't know how to fight him. So you let him call me a prostitute. You let him try to set you up with other women. You let him treat me like I was worthless. I know. I know, and I hate myself for it. But Harper, I love you. We can work through this. I'll set boundaries with my dad. I'll make him apologize." I shook my head. "Ethan, I don't want an apology he doesn't mean. And I don't want a marriage where I'm constantly fighting your father for scraps of respect. I deserve better than that. So what are you saying?" His voice cracked. "I'm saying I need time to think. I'm saying I can't marry into a family where I'll always be seen as not good enough. I'm saying I love you, but I love myself more." The gala was 3 days later, and I wore my dress blues. Every medal, every ribbon, every symbol of achievement I'd earned. My father flew in from Ohio, proud and emotional. Some of my team members attended as my guests. And when I walked into that ballroom, it wasn't as Ethan's questionable fiancé. It was as Lieutenant Commander Harper Lane, the Navy SEAL, who'd led rescue operations through a Category 5 hurricane. Richard saw me come in. I watched the emotions play across his face. Surprise. Annoyance. And something else. Something that might have been the first hint of doubt. The evening proceeded with testimonials from people who'd been rescued, from first responders who'd coordinated with military teams, from community leaders, thanking everyone who'd helped. And then Robert Patterson took the stage. "I'm here tonight because of the brave men and women who risked their lives during the hurricane. Specifically, I'm here because of Lieutenant Commander Harper Lane." He looked directly at me, and I felt tears prick my eyes. When she came through that door into my flooded room, I wasn't just seeing a rescuer. I was seeing the best of what America stands for. Competence, courage, compassion. She didn't care that I was a retired judge. She didn't care about my connections or my reputation. She cared about getting me and everyone else in that building to safety. And she succeeded. He paused, and his next words were clearly directed at Richard, who was sitting rigid at the head table. "I've known men who measured their worth by their pedigree, by their titles and their club memberships. But I've learned that true character is revealed not in a boardroom or at a society party, but in moments of crisis. And Lieutenant Commander Lane has more character in her little finger than most people I've met have in their entire bodies. We are honored to have her here tonight." The applause was thunderous. I felt my father grip my hand. And then I was being called to the stage to speak. I walked up there, my heart pounding, knowing that Richard was watching, that Ethan was somewhere in the crowd, that this moment mattered in ways I couldn't fully articulate. I stood at the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. "Thank you, Judge Patterson. Your words mean more than you know. I'm not used to being in the spotlight like this. My job usually involves operating in the shadows, doing what needs to be done without recognition. But I'm grateful for this opportunity to speak tonight, not just about the hurricane response, but about something bigger." I took a breath and found Richard in the crowd. "I've learned something important in recent months. I've learned that there are battles fought with weapons, and battles fought with words and attitudes, and the silent weight of other people's expectations. I've learned that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one shooting at you, but the one telling you that you're not good enough, that you don't belong, that you should know your place. I've also learned that the most powerful response to that enemy isn't anger or bitterness, but simply living your truth with such conviction that their doubts become irrelevant." I looked directly at Richard now. "I want to thank Ambassador Richard Whitmore for teaching me that lesson, for showing me through his doubts and his judgments that I didn't need his approval to know my worth, for reminding me that the only person who can make me feel inferior is myself, and I choose not to give anyone that power." The room was silent. Richard's face was unreadable. "Sir, you believed I wasn't good enough for your family because I came from nothing, because I worked with my hands and fought my way up and didn't have the right pedigree. But what you didn't understand is that those are precisely the things that made me good enough. Those are the things that taught me resilience and strength and the ability to keep going when everything seems impossible. During the hurricane, I didn't save those people because I went to the right schools or knew the right people. I saved them because I was trained, because I was dedicated, and because I understood that service means putting others before yourself. Those are the values I was raised with. Those are the values I'll pass on to my children someday. And those are the values that matter more than any bank account or family name. I paused and my voice softened. I hope someday you can see that. I hope someday you can understand that strength comes in many forms, and that the most valuable inheritance you can give your children isn't money or connections, but the ability to recognize worth in all its forms. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for supporting these relief efforts. And thank you for giving me the chance to prove once again that I am exactly who I was meant to be. The applause started slowly, then built into a standing ovation. My father was crying. My teammates were on their feet. And Richard Whitmore, former ambassador, man of influence and power, was also standing. Slowly, mechanically, but standing nonetheless. The look on his face was complex. Shame, pride, confusion. The crack in his armor I'd been hoping to create. After the speeches, people swarmed me. News outlets wanted comments. Veterans wanted to share their stories. But I kept watching Richard, who disappeared from the main floor. I found him 30 minutes later standing alone on a balcony overlooking the city lights. He turned when he heard me approach, and for the first time he looked old. Tired. Human. That was quite a speech, he said quietly. I meant every word. He was silent for a long moment. Then I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. You do, I agreed, not making it easy for him. I was wrong about you. About what you represented. About what you could offer my son. He turned to face me fully. I spent my life building a legacy, maintaining standards, protecting a certain way of life. And somewhere in that process, I forgot that the point of all that protection was to create something worth protecting. People worth protecting. Your son is worth protecting, I said. But he needs a father who sees his happiness as more important than his pedigree. Does he still have a chance? Do you still want to marry him? I'd been asking myself that question for days. I don't know. I know I love him. But I also know I can't spend my life fighting for scraps of respect from people who should give it freely. If Ethan and I have a future, it will be on different terms, with clear boundaries. With a real partnership where he stands beside me, not behind his family's expectations. Richard nodded slowly. I understand. And for what it's worth, I hope you give him that chance. He loves you more than I realized. And you've shown me more courage and grace than I've shown you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. This was my father's. He earned it in World War II, a Silver Star for valor. He was a sergeant, came from a family of farmers, worked his way up through sheer determination. I always resented that he hadn't given me the easy path some of my friends had. But watching you tonight, I realized he gave me something better. He gave me an example of what real strength looks like. I forgot that lesson somewhere along the way. He held out the box. This doesn't belong with me anymore. It belongs with someone who understands what it really means to earn honor. I opened it. A silver star, tarnished with age but still beautiful, rested on faded velvet. I can't accept this, sir. You already have. You earned it the moment you pulled Robert Patterson and 31 other people out of that flood. You earned it every time you chose courage over comfort. My father would have been proud to know you, and I'm ashamed it took me this long to see what was obvious to everyone else. We stood there in silence, a former ambassador and a Navy SEAL finding unexpected common ground. Eventually, I asked, what about Sterling? What about the others in your circle who think like you did? Richard's expression hardened. James showed his true colors during your confrontation. It turns out he's been involved in some questionable business dealings I wasn't aware of. Our friendship is over. As for the others, they can adapt or they can find new social circles. I'm done surrounding myself with people whose only achievement is being born into the right families. And Ethan Richards smiled, a real smile this time. He's inside, probably pacing a hole in the carpet, waiting to see if you'll talk to him. I told him I wouldn't interfere anymore, that whatever you two decide is between you. And I meant it. I found Ethan in a quiet corner of the library adjoining the ballroom. He stood when he saw me, his face a mixture of hope and fear. Harper, Ethan. We looked at each other for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice steady in a way I'd never heard before. I'm not going to ask you to marry me again. Not yet. Because I know I need to prove I've changed. I need to show you that I can be the partner you deserve, not the weak man who let his father dictate his life. I've given notice at my firm. I'm starting my own practice, focusing on pro bono work for veterans. I'm moving out of the apartment my parents bought. I'm building a life that's mine, not an extension of theirs. He stepped closer. And if someday you decide you can trust me again, if you decide I'm worth the risk, I'll be here. But I won't blame you if you walk away. I wouldn't blame you at all. I studied his face and saw something new there. Resolve. Maturity. The man I'd hoped he could be. I'm not walking away, I said finally. But we're starting over. Dating like normal people. No pressure from family, no expectations beyond what we build ourselves. Can you handle that I can handle anything if it means I get another chance with you? The kiss we shared was different from any we'd had before. It wasn't passionate or desperate. It was a promise. A commitment to build something real on our own terms in our own time. The months that followed were transformative. Ethan did exactly what he'd promised, building an independent life and a law practice that made a real difference. Richard kept his word too, stepping back, and more surprisingly, using his influence to support veteran causes in ways that actually mattered. He and I developed a cautious but respectful relationship built on mutual acknowledgement of past mistakes and present growth. Margaret emerged from her silence, revealing a woman who'd been trapped in her own gilded cage for years. She became an unexpected ally and friend, someone who understood the cost of conformity and admired my refusal to pay it. And me? I continued doing what I'd always done. Serving, leading, growing. But now I did it with a clearer understanding of my worth, with boundaries that protected my peace, and with the knowledge that I never needed anyone's permission to be extraordinary. 6 months after the gala, Ethan proposed again. This time in my father's workshop in Ohio, with grease on his hands from helping fix a transmission, no fancy ring, just a simple question. Will you build a life with me? Not the life anyone expects, but the one we choose together, I said yes. We got married in a small ceremony at the Naval Base Chapel. My father walked me down the aisle in his best suit. Richard stood beside Ethan, no longer the imposing patriarch, but a man humbled by his own misjudgments and working to become better. Margaret cried happy tears. My SEAL team formed an honor guard, and as we exchanged vows, I realized something profound. Victory wasn't about revenge or proving people wrong. Victory was about refusing to let anyone else define your value, about standing firm in who you are, even when the whole world seems to be pushing you to be someone else. Victory was about building a life so authentic and full that other people's doubts became nothing more than background noise. I thought I was fighting to be accepted by the Whitmore family. But what I was really fighting for was the right to accept myself completely unconditionally without apology. And that's a battle worth winning every single time. The respect I demanded, I first had to give myself. The love I sought, I first had to offer to the woman I saw in the mirror. The life I wanted, I first had to believe I deserved. And once I did that, everything else fell into place. Not perfectly, not easily, but authentically. Today, I'm still Lieutenant Commander Harper Lane. I'm also Ethan's wife, Richard's daughter-in-law, and a woman who knows exactly who she is and what she's worth. I learned that sometimes the people who challenge us the most become the catalysts for our greatest growth. That the moments we feel smallest are often the moments just before we realize how truly large we are. And that no one, absolutely no one, has the power to diminish you, unless you hand them that power first. I never handed it over, and I never will. So here's what I want to know from you. When was the last time you stood up for yourself, even when it would have been easier to back down? When was the last time you refused to shrink to fit someone else's expectations? Drop your story in the comments. Hit that like button if this resonated with you. Subscribe because we're building a community of people who refuse to be made small. And remember, your worth is not up for debate. It's a fact. The only question is whether you believe it strongly enough to make everyone else believe it too.